there, 6th grade science students. It's Miss Basor back with another episode of Shelter in Place 6th grade science. So today we're going to continue talking about the water cycle. And if you happen to visit one of the links that I posted in Google Classroom last week, one of the links was to this website brought to us by the USGS, and it's a very more complicated version of the water cycle. The water cycle can get really complicated when you start to envision all the different places that water can sit or be stored on Earth. But the part that we're going to focus in on today is this part here, which is where you can see the tree with the little raindrops having a picnic on top of it. It's a part of the water cycle called evapotranspiration. And although it's a little bit more complex, I find that this is a very important part of the water cycle, especially because it connects what we did in first semester when we talked about living things. It helps connect the water cycle to living things. And so we're going to focus on evapotranspiration today. Please remember that if you want to use it in Google Classroom, our note paper is available, so you can follow along with the note paper just like we would do in class, or you can just watch for your own benefit. So before we get into evapotranspiration, let's just review what we did last week. So if you remember, the first step of the water cycle is our evaporation, which is powered by the sun. This causes liquid water to change into water vapor gas. The next step of the water cycle is condensation. That's where water vapor as a gas turns back into a liquid. And when clouds get filled with too much liquid, we have precipitation, which is any form of water that falls back to Earth. And then finally, we have our collection step, which is where water is restored to Earth's surface. But most of us, when we think about collection, we tend to think of water that's sitting in lakes or ponds or oceans or puddles, and we tend to forget that there's water in other places, right? We have to remember that not all of Earth is covered in water. We do have land, and that land is covered with living things. In particular, the living things I'm talking about being plant life. And so if we take a step back here for a moment, we might remember that when we talk about the water cycle, we're not just talking about the atmosphere. We're not just talking about the hydrosphere and the lithosphere. We're also talking about the biosphere, the living things on our planet that have water in them, and that water is going to be stored in them in kind of a collection phase before it goes back into the atmosphere or back into the land or back into the larger bodies of water. So that means we need to take a moment to think back to what we learned in first semester about our plant life. I know this might be a little bit hard, might kind of have to dust off your brain cells, but hopefully you remember our little photosynthetic fairy, our sugar fairy, powered by the sun. I'm going to ask the question. I'll kind of pause to see if you want to shout out the answer. What is the name of the organelle that's found only in plants that takes energy from the sun and changes it into glucose or sugar? I hope you remember that that is the chloroplast. The chloroplast is the part of the plant cell that is responsible for photosynthesis. So I mention this because in order to understand evapotranspiration, we're going to have to remind ourselves about photosynthesis. So that's the first thing we're going to fill on our note paper here. Need to remind ourselves that plants must make their own food through photosynthesis. Remember, plants cannot go to the grocery store, they can't hunt down their own food, so they need to make their own food through photosynthesis, and this happens primarily in the cells of their leaves. That's why leaves are green, because they contain chloroplasts. And if you remember, the process of photosynthesis requires water along with carbon dioxide and sunlight. So this is why I'm mentioning it again, because, if we're talking about the water cycle and plants require water for photosynthesis, then that means plants are going to be an extension of the water cycle. So just to remind ourselves here, my little graphic, so photosynthesis is going to take in water and carbon dioxide. The plants are going to use that along with sunlight to create oxygen, and then we living organisms are going to then breathe in that oxygen, breathe back out that carbon dioxide, and the whole process repeats. So you might remember we spent some time talking about how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are linked. But I don't want to get too far into that. I want to get back to the plants. So let's remember that plants, right, they are needing to get water, and they move that water from their roots to their leaves, right? That's the primary way plants take in water. Their roots absorb the water from the soil, and then they bring it up to their leaves. But when we talked about that first semester, we kind of left out a part of this. We didn't consider what happens to the water when the water actually makes it to the leaves. So going microscopic here for a moment, I remember mentioning this, but you may have forgotten, that plant leaves have these tiny little openings, these tiny little pores that are called stomata, and that's how the plant is able to take in carbon dioxide, but it also means that this is a way that plants can lose water. It's also how they can give off oxygen, but our primary concern here is about how water can move out of that stomata entrance. So before we go on, let's capture that with our notes. The stomata. Plants move water from their roots to their leaves. And this water then evaporates from the leaves through small pores called stomata. So yet again, we're seeing this word evaporation come up, because when the water goes inside the plant, it's not locked in there forever. It does have the ability to come back out. And part of how this happens is kind of cool. You might remember that we learned about a specialized cell called xylem, and xylem was responsible for moving water in plants. Well, it turns out the evaporation of water through the stomata is the force that draws water upward against gravity, right? You may have considered, wait a minute, how can something like a tall redwood tree pull up water when gravity makes things go down? Well, it turns out water molecules cling to each other through very weak attractive forces, and then they move upward along the inside walls of the plant's vascular tubes, which we know are called xylem. So this is just kind of an interesting connection here to where we were talking about specialized xylem cells. It turns out that water leaving through the stomata is actually what is responsible for pulling the water upward. I like to think of it very much like drinking out of a straw. As you drink water out the top of the straw, the rest of the water in the glass gets pulled up through the straw, so this force actually allows water to travel hundreds of feet upward against the downward pull of gravity. Pretty awesome. So, this process of evaporating water from plant leaves is called transpiration. Not evaporation, but transpiration, and it's pretty darn important. Transpiration accounts for about 10% of the moisture in our atmosphere. A large oak tree can transpire 40,000 gallons, that's about 151,000 liters per year. So that means plants are a very active part of the water cycle. Water is constantly moving into plants and out of them and back into the atmosphere through the water cycle, through this process called transpiration. And it's not just water that's moving. Heat that's held in water molecules leaves the plant as the liquid water turns to vapor, which cools the plant and the air around it. So plants end up cooling the environment, providing both shade and this thing called evaporative cooling. So if I zoom in here, you'll notice that there is anywhere from a 7 to 10 degrees Celsius temperature difference between a place that is just cement or buildings and places that have plants. In fact, the best place you can be on a hot day is under a tree and on some grass, because as that plant evaporates its water, the heat that's in that water is going to leave, and that plant is going to end up cooling the air as well as the ground that's around it. So plants do this amazing service through the water cycle and through this transpiration process by not only moving water into the atmosphere, but also moving heat out of plants and off of the ground. So that's pretty important. So back to the ground here and water and plants. So if you can see here, this ground is very wet. There's actually some puddles of water there. So in total, all of this is going to end up evaporating. Not just the water that you can see pooled up in the puddles, but the water that's in the soil and the water that's in this grass. All of this is part of the water cycle. All of that will evaporate back into the air. Except when we're talking about plants, we're not going to say evaporate. We're going to use this much fancier word, which goes by evapotranspiration. So what this means is water in the soil that is not taken up by plant roots will also evaporate into the atmosphere. Therefore, evapotranspiration is the sum of evaporation from the land plus transpiration from plants. So that's what that big word means. It just means we consider water evaporating from the soil plus water that's evaporating from plants, but we don't just call that evaporation, we call it transpiration. So when you put all of this together, evapotranspiration includes water coming out of the soil as well as plants. And we will do an experiment later this week that proves that evapotranspiration is happening right outside your door. So the bottom line is water evaporates from more than just bodies of water. Evapotranspiration is transpiration from plants plus evaporation from the soil. And so that's why plants and vegetation are parts of the water cycle. So plants matter in the water cycle. It's called evapotranspiration. So thanks for checking in with me today. There's also a short little quiz that you can take to quiz yourself on evapotranspiration. See ya!